Dragon Age Origins was an ambitious game. My first experience with it was, as I imagine was the case for many people, one of surprise at the robustness, or perhaps more so depth, of the character origin experience. Before this, I had played KOTOR, another game we'll be getting into in some detail later, and a few CRPGs lightly, so I understood the structure of this kind of game to be one where every character has a default origin story, or a, at most, off-screen background people in the world referenced. I bring this up to establish a baseline of bespoke experiences. Going forward, we will be haunted by a background question of content and development, of effort versus payoff, and I think it's worth recognizing that they could have just not played out the origin sections and merely told us about our off-screen escapades. My goal is to discuss the concept of what I'll be calling protagosexuality, within and contrasting broader queer narratives in games as I see them. In short, protagosexuality is when the characters of a narrative have malleable sexualities that contort to fit the protagonist's identity while having an absence of other expressions of their own identity in this regard. Honestly, I'm sure this exploration has been done before. It's probably been done enough that in the good old days, James Somerton scraped like 20 scripts on this topic so he could pretend he invented gay nerds or whatever his bit was. Now, mind you, my example games are going to be kept sort of tight and a bit old for reasons of my own familiarity, and because I think I can put together a sort of narrowed vision and case study of romance from within that. That's not to say there's nothing contemporary to discuss, or that there's some motivated backslide, but as we'll get into, there does appear to be a bit of indirect consequences going on. Dragon Age will ultimately be a bit of a centerpiece, but it's not where we're starting. So let's step back a tiny bit, indeed not that far, and recognize that party member romance in the style of Dragon Age was not always a given, and if we want to contain ourselves to the BioWare style, then the origin point is Baldur's Gate 2, which had, surprise surprise, an overlap in creative minds, among them the writer David Gaider, who has often gone on record to talk about things like representation and queerness, and is directly relevant to several games I'll be bringing up. But with that, let's tap into a salient yet somewhat contested example of what I mean by a queer narrative as opposed to a protagosexual one. Let me tell you a little story about love, loss, and lesbians. How much do I have to explain Star Wars to do this? Juhani is like an alternative timeline window into what Catgirls could have. Juhani is a Jedi apprentice who believes she has slain her master and thus fallen to the dark side. To escape consequences as well as her own guilt, she flees the Jedi Academy. This is the context in which you meet her. Does that make sense for non-Star nerds? She's an acolyte at a religious space wizard school and she thinks she killed her teacher. Being a choice-driven RPG that revolves primarily around the axis of light and dark side choices, per the Star War, there are different details that affect her outcome. You can fail to save her and in turn be forced to kill her. You can outright choose to kill her. You can save her. And if you're a woman and you save her, you can call her beautiful. If you kill her, her friend, Belaya, is so aggrieved by her death that she falls to the dark side and vows to destroy you. I don't want to say that friends wouldn't go that far for each other, because I sincerely believe they could, but it is worth noting how deeply she is affected by the loss of a dear friend she used to watch the stars with. If you want a dramatized depiction of their love, there's a YouTube video I can direct you to. That is, if you believe their connection to be romantic. I do, but it was, in the past, a topic of contention. Though, mind you, by now there's nothing to prove. The writers have clarified their intentions with her as a character. Juhani is, in some argument, the first openly queer Star Wars character. In another, one could say she's still hiding behind just enough plausible deniability to not be open. She's certainly among the earliest party member characters in a party-driven game to express a queer sexuality. There's two circumstantial bits of evidence if we're only sticking to the text. One in her rejection of the advance of a friend and fellow student Dak, who is male. The other is that she has every reason to idealize and romanticize, not necessarily romance, a male protagonist, but the game doesn't allow a romantic angle. The evasion of protagosexuality itself is a semi-proof. I'm sorry if it seems silly to emphasize little things in the face of what feels apparent to us, but it has to be clarified that Juhani's romance is the only one that expressly avoids the word love and just says things like, I have an affection for you. Now, why is the dynamic presented like that? If you assumed that David Gaider, the openly gay writer for the game, had a hand in the inclusion of a plausibly deniable queer plot, you'd be among a lot of people, but you'd also be wrong. In Gaider's own words, The first time queerness came up was on Knights of the Old Republic with Juhani, and that wasn't my doing. I was, in fact, completely startled by the idea that not only was this a thing that could happen, but more so that my fellow developers, the vast majority of whom are straight men, would not only be okay with it, but actually want to include it. The source for this quote is a post called On the Gay Thing, and it's interesting and worth a read. Link below. It's at the very least interesting that the push for Juhani wasn't by the, at least out, queer staff, but I don't think that lessens her position. That said, Gaider is also hesitant to take the position of Juhani as an explicitly queer character. Per his tweet Almost Lost to Time, we couldn't have her say I love you to another woman, for instance, or refer to her past relationships as anything other than friends. As a brief aside, I feel like I remember originally meeting the claims of her queerness with a "can't people just be emotional and sensitive about platonic friendships?" And while I stand by that very general concept, now's not the time or case of its application. On the other side of things, we have the question of potential versus canon. Is a game potential a sign of a canon truth? A canon pairing for a female Revan as a concept is fascinating to me because Revan is canonically male. So we've devised this layer of semi-accuracy. If you choose to declare Revan was a woman in your KOTOR 2 run, Karth was the relation she had. So there's functionally a non-canon lesbian path for a non-canon female main character. But the potential for it at all is interesting. The question of potential outcomes presenting inalienable facets of characters contorts even more in a protagosexual framing. Reframing and reiterating the definition of protagosexuality is attraction to a protagonist that is agnostic of said protagonist's identity and does not actually support an unerring canon queerness of a character. I differ this from just saying everyone is bisexual because a core element of this whole discussion is the absence of external grounding. I'm not asking Sebastian von Stardew Valley to prove he's been with a woman before. This isn't bisexuality means testing, it's about established perpetual truths. As a fun aside for Stardew Valley, actually, Lee's ex's gender always matches the protagonist, which is an interesting move that makes her functionally anything but bisexual. We won't be diving into that game, but it's also worth noting that despite protagosexual organizing of relations, there are some distinct differences in character outcomes in queer relationships. That will be an important marker going forward. Protagosexuality is distinguished equally by the lack of anchor details just as much as it is the lack of acknowledged gendered and queered relationship differences. Full protagosexuality means little to no difference in how a male-female versus female-female romance plays out in a given game. The significant thing about Juhani is that she is not protagosexual. She is a lesbian, or at the absolute most verifiable and undeniable, not interested in the male protagonist. Female protags have a different dialogue, have access to a romance option here. To cover one silly base, it's also possible that male protag and Dak are both just not the kind of guy Juhani is into. In some sense, I wish this was the case, because it's rare for a character to express having romantic thoughts, like literally ever, that have no chance of intersecting the protagonist. I know people don't play video games to be politely rejected, but something about it compels me. Serana is the only valid Skyrim character, and her not having a romance option is extremely relevant to her character, and it annoys me every time Sorry, I'll refocus. And with this, it's probably a good time to start talking about an entirely different game. Let's get this out of the way just to set us up. Dragon Age Origins does not have much to explicitly say about queer love as a function of plot. The gayest plot beat is the moment where they, for some reason, decided to Saint Sebastian twinkify the king with his unbloodied and unwounded body with 3 little spikes in it, despite the fact he died like a ketchup packet. That said, it does have a general approach to persecution and have queer characters. Dragon Age has a deceptively complex setting. I suppose I say this a lot for fantasy settings, but forgive that as a result of the fact the genre itself is setting defining. There are elves and dwarves, and there's magic and a not Christianity religion, and there's witchers, Grey Wardens, and the dwarves. Did you know they've been reduced from a great empire and they lost all their holds to the not orcs? And I joke, but it's a little less paint by numbers than it seems on first and second blush. I wouldn't call Thetis the peak of imagination, but there's some elements that are interesting, and it's more about what they pull together than the pieces. For our purposes, I want to focus on two things: persecution, and the topic of this video by proxy with gender and sexuality. There are several persecutions squarely and actively demonstrated in the setting, with mages and the active danger persecution they receive contrasted with the dwarven caste system and the elves who are experiencing second-class status and ghettoization. There's not a need to, functionally, overburden the setting with even more persecutions. And yet, there's always stuff that sneaks in. There's a declaration of functional sexism over as per the character creation screen. And, well, when you do that, you're gonna put me on alert to think even more about the sexism that still exists in the narrative, and indirectly, you've kind of outed those moments as less world-building conscious choices and more writer biases. This world still contains both sexism and gender roles, and that's going to impact sexuality. There's a lot of talk of warrior men and wives at home for a setting where gender has no bearing. But also, I do note the tradition Dragon Age Origins is bucking with this notice, one where older D&D capped female characters' strength, offered sexism as flavor, and indeed had to write guides for how to play as women because they assumed nobody would ever default to doing so. I'm not requesting that it become more overt, a plot point, so to speak, that Dragon Age introduce some kind of grimdark, rampant sexism and puritanism to its setting as forms of persecution. That wouldn't necessarily mean they have more to say about gender. In fact, the grim and the dark of the game are most present on the sexism front. The city elf origin and the, cruel desires of the human lord who is kidnapping elf women on the day of a wedding can attest to that. Through a companion, we learn that Ferelden is more close-minded about sexuality than at least his homeland of Antiva, the Mideast-coded land of assassins freed from Western mores in a way that sometimes flirts with Orientalism. In fact, we only really learn about this closed-mindedness from being able to demonstrate it ourselves as players. Zevran will say something like, "I had the pick of my fancy, anything I wanted, wine, women, men." And you can respond, "Men?"
In Antiva, being a crow gets you respect. It gets you wealth. It gets you women. And men. Or whatever it is you might fancy. But that does not mean doing what is expected of you always. And it means being expendable. It's a cage, if a gilded cage. Pretty, but confining. I fancy many things. I fancy things that are beautiful, and things that are strong. I fancy things that are dangerous and exciting. Would you be offended if I said I fancied you? Oh, you're speaking seriously, aren't you? I do forget that this is not Antiva City. We are a little more open-minded about such things where I hail from. Is this something that I should beg pardon for?
Beyond that, there's not really a vector for attitudes towards sexuality to come out. No NPC heckles you for holding hands with Liliana as a female warden or something while you're on your way to buy apples at the market or whatever lesbians get up to. Homophobia is an implied default of this world in some sense, but not an experienced one. Given David Gaider, the game's lead writer, declared in a post that he didn't want to make games center the issues, I can't really fault this. I empathize with his concern that people would see him adding visible queer struggle as some kind of inevitable consequence of having a gay writer, which sounds unpleasant. And the alternative is what? Some needless homophobia moment in service of reminding people that the world is unkind? The presumed default is Schrodinger's homophobia. It doesn't exist until it does, and it only does in response to the player's own questioning, not in some unprovoked, unavoidable moment of the game. Schrodinger's homophobia. You really can just say anything, you know? Sexism, on the other hand, I relinquish the point on far less. The world is gendered, the clergy gendered. The queen having a regent doesn't strike people as odd, implying she is, despite the character creation blurb, not educated to lead. Not educated like a man would be. So we have a world that is both very willing to take persecution and put it in sharp focus more than once, letting it motivate all but arguably two of the origins, and a world that does not want its story to be too real, and I think that was a good call. Because, in some sense, none of that matters really. Origins doesn't need a world with strong homophobic persecution to tell a story of queer love. I do feel like some opportunities are lost, however. But perhaps I'm just reading too deeply into things. I've been getting into the habit of scouring for hidden meaning lately, like with the book. The book is a tome among tomes, a composition of facts, findings, and secrets to the construction of civilization. It's also, incidentally, beautifully rendered. The hand-drawn art and retrofuturist style is fun and compelling. There's cute references all over the place, and the hand-drawn nature of it means you can pore over details. And sometimes you find something waiting for you. Sometimes it'll be occasional motifs, and sometimes symbols. Once you start finding them, you'll look for them everywhere, and then you'll start looking for the meaning behind them, and then, well, I'll leave it there. As someone who grew up on books the likes of illustrated encyclopedias, it almost feels like a natural progression of that, artistically refined in a sense. The book was crowdfunded to an unprecedented level and in turn has spared no expense. It draws you in with a balance between beauty, detail, and simplicity, making it easy to learn lots of new little things on every page. And if you're looking for something more, something deeper, it's there waiting for you if you go looking. And on the note of romance, the theme of this video, there's a few pages on the subject that had to be redacted from the book, but come with it in an envelope you may open at your own discretion. Be sure to check out the link below or the handy QR code to look more into the book, and if you're so inclined as to get yourself a copy, use the promo code Rosencreutz at checkout for 10% off. Now I feel like I was talking about something else. What was it? Leliana is this game's Joan of Arc, and she's from this setting's not France. She's religiously motivated and she claims to have visions. She is sometimes described as a nun in discussing her and tells tales of sapphic convent behavior. I'd argue that her position in the not Christianity church of the setting, as well as the stance of the church, called the chantry, on things like sexuality and the role of women all erode the presumed cliche of lesbian nuns. There's a tough to disentangle element to that cliche which wraps back onto some homophobic concepts like that it doesn't count with women, and to the untrained eye she plays into this by having a lower romantic threshold for physical intimacy with women. But that concept can't really fit onto this world where we don't see it actually play out, where there isn't a response to homosexuality or an actual full Bible to read with condemnations in it, and where the church is both unclear on its concepts of marriage and fidelity and is, well, itself matriarchal. Further, she's not exactly cloistered, nor has she taken the more significant vows implied to exist. She's a lay priest and was not raised in the chantry. Like, even if celibacy were a general rule, it may not even apply to her, and I don't know if I can say such things like chastity are consistent in the world of Dragon Age. And beyond all that, she expresses a canon queer love outside of moments of comfort in the chantry, though I admit that the nature of her relationship to Marjolaine is interpretable. On the other end from questions of chastity and ill-defined affections, we have our other little case study in Zevran. Zevran is an assassin who fails to kill you, considers his own life forfeit in that instance, and pledges himself to you. He was an orphan raised in a brothel before being sold into the brutal upbringing of an assassin's guild. The guild, the Antivan Crows, are a respected part of their society, so despite his position as basically a slave to the guild, it comes with perks and prestige. This all lends itself to a character who is easy to cast and intuit both trauma and certain liberations onto. Zevran is sort of a foil to Leliana. Where her past is obscured, his is open. Where she is driven by a specific moral code, ambiguous though it is in the game, he lacks one. That's not to say he's amoral, but there's a cultural and occupational tendency towards moral relativism. Where Leliana occasionally laments how easy killing is for her, Zevran sees it as an occupation and has no real concerns about it, or sees it as a mark of pride. Where Leliana has certain reservations about sexuality, Zevran has almost none. Now, that all said, a different tangled element emerges, another negative cliche one could read. Zevran's sexuality as a product of trauma. Or perhaps it's wrong to frame that as a negative cliche, but I think you understand what I mean. That he is like this because of his childhood as an orphan raised in a brothel turned into a murder slave. What I think this ignores, to an extent, is that he's from a society where very little of his upbringing is abnormal or shameful, in a culture where his sexuality is, more or less, entirely normal. What I find compelling about these two characters, early as they are on the party RPG queer romance scene, is that they don't feel protagosexual while functionally being no different from that framework. They do, in fact, have an attraction to your player irrespective of your choice between two genders. What makes it different? Well, for one, they express an interest in people beyond the protagonist in real time. For two, they have sexuality embedded into their history. It shapes parts of who they both are as characters. As stated, there are some iffy ways to read Zevran's flirtations and, promiscuity, but something about his approach compels me. In a funny way, I can't help feeling like the "please stop flirting with me" button was added for heterosexual male comfort, which is fine, but in practice it just makes him seem respectful. It came up that I might be uncomfortable with his advances, and he changed how he spoke to me, and that's it. Contrast that with, be it by bug or just the natural jank of the affection system, the way that Leliana accused me of sleeping with Morrigan in a run where I hadn't spoken to Morrigan since the second I obtained Win, specifically because several conversations prior I made what amounts to a lewd joke, I think. There's a "you can probe me anytime" response, and I guess it's a romance path flag. And then later Morrigan asked about my sex life with Liliana, who my character hadn't even kissed yet, and my only options were "none of ya business" or "yeah, we bangin'," and frankly that kind of cornering and insinuating and telling me I've done something I haven't feels way weirder than anything Zevran has done. Ugh, Morrigan. I can't, I won't, I refuse, I must refuse, but somewhere in my soul is a half-hour video called "In Defense of Dogboy" about Alistair and Morrigan and how I think she's actually the dumber one. We can't afford to tangent, and by now I've already made more Destiel fans mad with this video than I've ever intended to in my life. If you think those aren't related, you don't understand the threads that tie our universe together. But on the note of Alistair, an important thought. There are mods for this game that de-gender the romance options. Alistair is a notable target for such mods. This is functionally a protagosexualizing mod. In this, a sort of power fantasy of availability emerges, and in turn you get a story that doesn't quite fit because his romance was written with gender in mind. That's not a moral judgment on the mod users, of course. I understand why one might find Zevran being their sole option unappealing. In short, Zevran isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, and his kind of love, detached from sexuality itself and lacking wholesomeness, so to speak, sort of means that any character who loves him has to be okay with and match all that. If you're a male protag attracted to men but not into threesome-suggesting murderer elves for maker knows what reason, you might as well have no romance options at all. Alistair doesn't ask much of a player character in terms of, like, alternative relationship shape, and like I said, there's some baggage to Zev's depiction. Which makes it all the stranger that a decade later, the only male-male pairing in Rogue Trader is also a BDSM trauma elf. Diversity win? Anyway, neither dynamic present in Liliana or Zevran go the ideal distance I'd like. Part of that is a product of their world having a murky grasp on what it wants to say about gender and roles. Liliana, early as she is in this world of queer romance, hints at it, and that's kind of a lot. In having a distinctly different approach to women than men, she's acknowledging something. Does it play into sapphic nun tropes? Maybe. Into "it doesn't count with a woman" tropes? I'm sure that's a read. But it's ultimately about her uneven comfort levels. Does her relation with a woman take a distinctly different shape? Not a huge one, no. I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but you can see why it's an interesting early point, yeah? And protagosexuality cannot address gender dynamics because it is blank. It's like Zevran without the grounding background, without viewing from the side, NPC to NPC, to buttress that he's like that outside the world of just talking to the protagonist. Before we close in on reasons for all this, which I'm sure are being screamed at the screen, I'd like to detour into a specific relationship dynamic from a different game because it feels like another notable queer relationship representation milestone, I suppose I'd call it. Now, if I mention polyamory, I'm going to cut the active viewers by 10% for reasons I'm sure are fine and normal. In the context of RPGs, the first thing that comes to mind with respect to polyamory is either accidental poly through sheer absence of feedback, or like JRPG harem-y things, and with the latter, I'm not even sure that's something I can evidence so much as a cultural impression left by anime. That the female party members don't mind if you activate multiple romances or whatever. The former case is something like Fallout 4, where there's just genuinely no response to starting multiple relationships. Then again, there's also no response to the way they've given you a core, inescapable story hook of having had a child with your spouse that you're looking for. Romanceables barely mention your previous life, which is really odd in hindsight. For those of you with a bingo sheet out, you can now mark down the barely suppressed Fallout 4 rant for this video. Pathfinder PolyculeMaker has a throuple. Octavia and Regengar are a couple that you can be invited into. This is the first time I can think of an explicitly clear throuple in gaming that the player can participate in that isn't just what I'd call the power fantasy of permissive harem building. Now that gets a bit complicated by the fact that the harem building definition I'm working with here is a character being like, oh, I don't mind if you fool around with her also, teehee. And that's partly the vibe of Octavia and Reg, except that's between each other. You are not the vertex of affection here. The player can become attached to one of them or broaden the dynamic of both of them, but the relationship predates and does not center you. Now I want to be very clear here. These characters and their approach to romance are directly shaped by their upbringing. In some sense, they thus parallel our Dragon Age case studies, more so one than the other. It is a very defining part of their characters. To explain all of this, I have to spoil a bit of the subject. Regengar and Octavia were raised in a society that I can only call a technocratic slave state with libertine oligarchic tendencies. It's a very do what your power allows you to do kind of place, and that extends to owning slaves. Sort of KOTOR Sith Lordy if you think about it. Anyway, so as former slaves of that world, they revel in freedom from two angles, one of recent liberation and the other from the libertine quasi-hedonism they were raised around. That's not to say this is the only formula by which throuple-minded people might be formed, obviously, but it does inform their mix of devotion and obligation to each other, discomfort with ownership, attachment to ownership, and do-what-you-like attitude that quite inevitably spills onto the player's dynamic with either or both of them. Again, this calls into question the defining of sexuality, especially the notion of queerness within settings where we have no guarantee something is actually strange. The writers know that they've written something that will be strange to the audience, despite the setting having a non-reaction or limited reaction to it. In fact, once again, our only real moment of seeing a response to the concept of a throuple is the player character dialogue options. And if you romance only one of them, they remain attached to each other. You are not monogamizing one of them. Kingmaker doesn't display much romantic agency from other party members, but in turn, we have a pre-established relationship that defines its characters. The relationship may be agnostic of the protagonist's identity, and it may not change the writing much based on said identity, but it finds a different way to buck protagosexuality, via the decentering of the protagonist. It offers another framing for what protagosexuality is and does. So now we have a lot of variety to think about as we move towards the why of all of this. Protagosexuality is both an intended power fantasy and a byproduct of writing choices. My inspiration for writing this video was one by Ruby Seals of Codex Entry on the nature of Persona 3 Portable's added female protagonist and how this protagonist has a fundamentally different experience of the characters around her. Thus, it is argued that Persona 3 Portable is the only game that lets you choose your gender, which is only partial hyperbole. In the framing of a game changing one's gendered experience of the world, it's far more comprehensive than the usual Control F and replace of heh with tee-hee. In some deep sense, it feels like games that reject protagosexuality are, to borrow Ruby's framing for gender, the only ones that let you be queer. This sounds like a harsher criticism than it is, truth be told. I think comparing my point to Ruby's does a bit of disservice to good games that have opted for the protagosexuality angle for some of the positive reasons we've meandered through, ranging from power fantasy to blanket representation to simply letting a game world exist without tons of baggage. But in an ideal situation, we wouldn't have this issue, and there could be both bespoke writing and a much wider range of representations rather than this either-or situation. So why aren't we in the ideal one? There's a certain economizing of resources that goes into game development broadly. They don't have infinite time, much less infinite budget, but then there's other constraints like file sizes and hardware capabilities. Writing, as one of the many creative processes in game design, faces a fair few of these constraints, not to mention when more writing requires other parts of the game to also have more work done. Oh, a scene that takes place in a certain kind of setting. Well, now they have to decide if it will reuse an asset that doesn't perfectly fit, make a whole new asset for the location, or change or cut the writing around what they already have available. So a fancy restaurant uses the same background as the cafe from the first hour of the game, or they go to what now seems like the only cafe in the city. All of that is pretty intuitive to anyone who has played a video game and thought about what it takes to make any multimedia creative project happen. Given the expansion of expectations for voiced characters, writing might even be the cheapest part of the process of expanding a game. something something Moro and easy to mod because you don't need a voice actor to add 20,000 lines of new dialogue. The other side of what creates value isn't the cost of the input, the effort to make the parts of the game, but a sort of demand. Is this what players actually want to see? Is this what they care about? And increasingly, I imagine, is this something that will get people going feral online? Yes, technically writing has always had this question, and people can get confused or fatigued when a book spends 5 straight chapters on the adventures of some side character that doesn't land for anyone, but when there's not the question of developer resource allocation multiplying the scrutiny, it's not as bad. So we have it that fans debate if X or Y thing was worth putting in the game. And, well, you can see how that implicitly taps into the question of queer romance options when the majority of players won't explore it. I can imagine there's people who would say, why would the developers spend time on a facet of play that only a small percent of players will want to see? There's an argument for maximizing visibility of efforts, functionally making it so most players wind through the stuff that took the most effort to make, so none of it is wasted. But games sequester content to particular playstyles and playthroughs all the time. Is it really that much more work to write an actual queer romance? To write something and gatekeep it as queer run-only content? To go back to Ruby's whole video, because the PSP worked well with file sizes for stuff like text, they could expand the game on the social link side with ease relative to the effort it takes to write new plots. Most of the assets still exist for malleable use anyway. And in that light, the cost would diminish. Protagosexuality is economical. It maximizes representation potential without, at its base version, requiring rewrites and lore drops and grounding. But it loses, I don't know, call it potential, call it texture. Do you see how making a character only romanceable from a same-sex angle adds texture to that character? In the space of the protagosexual world, everything is the ungrounded hypothetical of potentiality that means it all equally happens just as much as it does not happen. The queer romance is just as canon as a class choice. And unless a character is like Zevran and makes explicitly clear their queerness in other moments of dialogue outside of explicit romance, we can't really consider them as representative of anything. But if a character mentions nothing about their sexuality ever, but can only be, as a woman, romanced by another woman, then we know that character is a lesbian. Even if the romance never happens in your playthrough, that person's sexuality is still the same static canon thing. So then, what do I actually want to see? Is it just more boxes ticked in a more thorough fashion? Indirectly, maybe, but more than anything, my actual interests are in a different direction that I think can still be relatively economical as a writing choice. I want more of the character-centric and party-driven games to explore the NPC agency to find love. Which takes us to an example I didn't think I'd be revisiting again, with its, for better or worse, approach to character-on-character romance. Fire Emblem support conversations, how I seemingly love to complain about you. Look, I've spared you 2 rants already, if not more. Let me have this. Before I do so, I should explain the functional history and purpose of support conversations as briefly as I can. Support conversations are dialogues between 2 characters earned after reaching a threshold of friendship points between said characters, usually through ending a turn in proximity to each other or committing actions near one another. The conversations are, ultimately, a significant source of viewing from the side when it comes to character interactions. Why is this special? Well, party-driven RPGs, JRPGs, Bioware RPGs or otherwise, tend to have party chatter or static story beat moments at most. Characters have an arc between them to an extent, but it's usually core enough to the narrative to be unavoidable, or it doesn't happen. Support conversations are entirely optional and a product of your actions. So, to contrast, Tales of games have story beat chats and these unvoiced side conversations that occasionally appear, sometimes between the whole party, sometimes between a few characters, and even absent the protagonist at times. Dragon Age only really has the "oh, you crossed a bridge" chats and the moral dilemma debate moments. That's not to say those are insignificant themselves. I've craved that dynamic in other games before, and dropped a game, Octopath Traveler, when I learned there was no inter-party dynamic. But Fire Emblem genuinely is doing something different. It hides tons of its characterization behind optional conversations that specifically center a bond between 2 given characters. Perhaps another time I'll give a fuller dissection of this, but making a game with an emphasis on shipping characters so they could produce child units transformed the nature of support conversations, making them more core to the game while also necessitating a kind of romantic potential to many of them. This leads us to Fire Emblem ending slides. It depends on the game how exactly these work, but the rough cut of it is that characters are paired up in their ending slides based on supports with each other. In the games not expressly about having children, a high support didn't necessarily mean being romantically paired off, and if there was a romance, it was an epilogue detail among many. Now, with that explained, this traditionally meant that people had 3 platonic conversations and then the ending slide would mention an eventual fondness. In Three Houses, the latest Fire Emblem release of any note, something changed, and instead, a lot of the A-support conversations have this weird, blurry, barely deniable anti-platonic film over them for male-female pairings. The music gets what I can only call tender.
Ash was the property of the Imperial Army. My apologies, Petra. My idea turned out to be worthless.
It was not worthless. It had great worth. You gave me great help so I could be smoking all of that meat.
Characters stumble over words and say stuff that reads too romantic, nigh confessing a love, and then go, "Object to you? Why would I do that? You're my best friend, and we're going to keep on going on fishing trips together until the end of time." It's almost like they accidentally plausible deniabilified and closeted straight pairings? Wait, is Fire Emblem Three Houses queering straight romance? No, stop. Bad. With this model, we hit what feels like a worst of both worlds, where nobody is allowed to be expressive and romantic, and nobody is allowed to be platonic friends all at once. Rather crucially for our purposes, the supports between 2 non-protagonists have no dialogue choices. You are not directing the scene. In turn, there's no way to pivot the dialogue toward or away from romantic energy. It feels like they developed a solution for something that was not a problem. It's like they found the old model of eventually they fell in love and slides to be not enough, but didn't actually commit to more than that when there wasn't a eugenics mechanic in play. Yeah, Fire Emblem has eugenics, just like Pokemon, get over it. I need to note that Fire Emblem does not have protagonists in the sense we've been discussing or circling around usually. While there were self-insert intended protags in Awakening and Fates, they were their own characters we customized rather than blank slates like in Three Houses. Technically, the blank slate was devised earlier and at its blankest with Mark in Fire Emblem 7, who was more like a conceit for our story viewing than a character. Now with that said, we are not limited to viewing the world through anyone's eyes, and we often see conversations, plot significant or otherwise, that we are not there for, chief among them being said support conversations. Now, with all that, let's get to 2 points. 1, this model shows the rough cut of what I think could be explored more, the development of relationships outside the protagonist. If a game wants to argue that romance is part of the grand adventure, then surely other characters deserve some of the agency to have it develop for them too. After all, your party members spend more time with each other than you do, even if it's a weird friend circle that sort of formed around one person. 2, it produces a different angle for understanding economized writing. It's got an entirely different form of ambiguous writing which feels devised to maximize the open possibility of dialogue. Economized writing is at the heart of all of this. There are of course other pitfalls in the support conversation system in that game, chief among them being that the time skip makes it so if you didn't get the supports in the proper paced order, you'll have someone basically be like, you made me spill my juice, scene end, see support gained. 5 years and 1 war later, hey, sorry about that time when I made you spill that juice, B support gained. Look, let me get my cheap shots where I can, okay? Also, while we're here, I should note the queer count among students in Three Houses, by the way, and how it's only protagosexually expressed and never a character element. In short, there are a few characters that retain S support potential with a same-sex byleth. There are no S supports between students in that game, but the ending slides are again plausibly deniable at their absolute best. I don't know, maybe I'm just not convinced it's actually inherently sapphic to open an orphanage with your female best friend, but what do I know? And with that, the final question. Does any of this matter? In seeking perspective for this video, I reached out to several people across IRL friends, internet friends, and what I can only call workplace friends, people I know through my job on the internet. I'm not going to claim the range is a perfect sample size of humanity, reason being not least of which because it's a very non-diverse sample. I mean, sure, I covered like 3 continents and several gender expressions and stuff, but everyone turned out bisexual. As a confession, I cringe at video game erotic scenes, and maybe that means they're not for me. But then again, I also cringed at Liliana's singing cutscene, so maybe I'm just not taken with displays of passion. This is part of why I asked for some perspective. I wanted to get a sense for if I was being weird or if I, in my position of relative indifference to representation in romance, was missing something. And I ended up having some fruitful conversations that, true to form, put things in perspective. I do still think there's a casualty of queer stories in the mix here. I do still think that it's daunting that Juhani's bar is a hard one to surpass, and I do still think that lots of protagosexuality is written to be straight relationships and just palette swapped. But I also recognize that the power fantasy of protagosexuality goes beyond just sheer desirability and into not just an accepting world, but into representation. Is a narrowed dating pool an innately queer experience? Maybe. Is it one I think could be explored in good writing? Yeah. Do I think it's up to the Baldur's Gate 3s of the world to do that? No, of course not. There's other stories to explore and better means to do so. Seeing a character's queerness from the side, from NPC to NPC conversations, grounds their desire, their being. More than anything, I think doing a touch more of that without making everyone a rampant flirt, which would get old, is probably the best way to really get a bit of both. Leliana compels me because she expresses desire outside the player and has an uneven approach to sexuality with women and with men. Despite, in practice, ending up in the same place of a potential attraction to your protag no matter the details, it feels clear she's not just queer to suit the player character. Zevran, on the other hand, is a loose, lusty libertine with almost an inverse approach. Sexuality is so second-natured that it doesn't even feel bounded. Far from protagosexual, you're not even special to him, but it's earned. Ultimately, it may not be an authentic or real experience to have a protagosexual world. I don't concede the bad fantasy argument of, but there's elves, so who cares, as though fantasy the genre ungrounds everything around it. But with that said, I reiterate that I do think there's space for and value in protagosexual design. I just want to see a touch more effort done to make sure we don't lose something along the way. So what I'm saying is I need 10 new canon bisexuals on my desk by Monday, or else you're fired. Hi, I hope that was a good one for you. I know it's a bit out of my normal scope, but also, what even is my normal scope at this point? Anyway, sorry it took a long time. Between a break, the admin of being reorphaned and getting sick, and as well as convincing myself I needed to play the entirety of Origins to be able to make my point, this one took longer than expected. Thank you to the viewers and subscribers and patrons for sticking around. It's been like 4 years now or something, which is daunting and wouldn't be possible or obviously worth doing without anyone to tell me I'm using Begs the Question wrong. And with that, special thanks goes to Alessandro Andrioni, Chen Gursa, Cesare Mikua, Clever Riley 9, Dan C, Galactic Beyond, Gilded Dragon, Hornlit, Isaac of Lyria, Jay Kasky, Laird Olive, Listing FMA, Mark Soto, Mehrab, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nito Pier, Nug Snuggler, Riley Long, Sipper Turnipsy, Third Xeno, Turtle D Magnum, Vichere, and Yura Sikorsky. And thank you to Hungry Minds for sponsoring. Use the code Rosencreutz for 10% off after following the link below if the book seems like it'd fit your life. I actually have a good idea of what next time is going to be, and there might be delays as I learn to mod Victoria 3 for some reason. Bye.
One day the Paragon Branco will return. Oh, and on that day,